Bore da a croeso nôl. Good morning and welcome back to day 2 of the Cymorth Cymru annual conference. We started off the day there with a video from one of our day sponsors, Cymru, extraordinary work supporting people with learning disability across Wales. A big thank you to our sponsors for this online conference. We wouldn't be able to make it happen without you. So our main conference sponsors, Dalton and Digital Communities Wales, as well as our day sponsors, which are Cardiff Housing Association, Cymru, United Welsh and the National Lottery Community Foundation. Welcome back to day 2. The theme of today is learning from the response to COVID, and our sponsor for today is Cardiff Housing Association. Thank you very much. We've got a packed agenda learning from all sorts of aspects of the response to homelessness, the use of digital support, and of course how to support people with no recourse to public funds once this pandemic is over. I'm absolutely delighted that we're kicking off today with Pete Mackie, who many of you will be familiar with. He's one of the leading researchers on homelessness and housing in Wales. He's been part of a team that's looked at research around the responses to homelessness across the different constituent nations of Great Britain during the pandemic. We know that with devolved powers, different institutions, different governments are able to respond in different ways, and we've certainly seen a different approach here and across the border, something that was touched on by John Sparks yesterday. But however, there's no one size fits all. There's no country that has necessarily got everything right, and there's lots of learning to be taken from all of the nations of Great Britain. So I'm really delighted to introduce our first speaker today, Dr. Peter Mackie, who will talk you through the research that he's published recently. Thanks, Pete.
Thanks, Katie. All right, Gwyn, can we get the slides up? Am I going to be able to see them too? Here we go. Oh, look at that, seamless. So we're going to do a bit of a Pete Mackie turns Chris Whitty, and also has to laugh at his own jokes, with Gwyn kind of moving these slides on as and when I ask. But firstly, yeah, thanks for giving me the chance to speak today. You know, a lot of what I'm going to say you'll be familiar with probably, but really the study was a chance to take stock, to look across what's happened, what the different responses were across the GB nations, and just document that really at this stage. We'll be able to move on to kind of look more critically in the next phase of the research. But really this presentation today is just documenting some of the key things that happened and drawing out some of the key themes. Gwyn, so let's pop on to the first slide. So in terms of the things that I'll talk about, I'll just let you know a little bit about the study, the methods that we used, and then there are 3 or 4 sections. So I'll talk initially about the pre-COVID homelessness policy context, and that might seem strange, but you know, some of the folk in the audience might not know about the different legislative and policy contexts in Scotland and England, but also these proved to be really important in terms of the nature of the response and the ongoing challenges that we're facing in the different nations. So we'll just briefly spell out some of that. Then we'll talk about the headline policy, legislative and funding responses during the pandemic. And then the majority of the presentation, what I'll do is just draw out kind of 9 or so themes and learning from the crisis, and then end by looking to the horizon. What's on the horizon? What are we worried about? What are the opportunities? So that's the broad structure of the presentation. There will be tons of time for questions. It turns out my participatory style of presenting and walking around the stage does not translate onto Zoom well, as my students are telling me. So there'll be tons of time anyway. Right, let's move on, please, Gwyn. So a wee bit about the study. As I say, it was to look comparatively across the 3 nations. Methods, we had documentary analysis. Important in terms of the documentary analysis is, you know, so much is contained, hidden away in folks' websites or whatever, and I can't. There's no irony here that we're at the Cymorth conference, and one of my main sources for documentary evidence was the Cymorth website. I think I'm probably the only person that has gone through every single one of those briefings from Cymorth and looked and tracked across to try and piece together what happened. So documentary analysis, then interviews in all 3 nations, and there with kind of key policymakers, key service providers. entirely qualitative for those interviews. In England, we were able to draw upon the homelessness monitored data, so a survey of English local authorities. So there were 148 responses to that survey. And then 25 interviews with people who'd experienced homelessness during the pandemic. And it really is important to say this is an interim report that I'm talking to. It's a fairly lengthy interim report for those that have looked at it, but we are planning a kind of a second stage in the spring, summer of this year, towards the summer, where we'll reflect on what's happened after the initial lockdown period. So most of what I'm going to talk to, we were doing the interviews, kind of from June all the way through to October, and then adding in some of the documentary evidence up to December. That's our study period. But most of what we're going to talk about is that initial lockdown period. Thanks, Gwyn. Right, so a little bit about the pre-COVID context. Very, very quickly. So Scotland, as many of you all know, kind of is the outlier, is different in the way its legislation works compared to England and Wales, in that they've abolished the priority need criteria, which basically means if you are single, if you're a family and you become homeless, then you're entitled to temporary accommodation. And there are standards to be met around that temporary accommodation. That proved to be really, really important, and we'll talk about that later on. In England and Wales, of course, the legislative changes that were led in Wales and then followed in England around the Housing Wales Act and the Homelessness Reduction Act meant, yes, there's no requirement for temporary accommodation to be provided for everybody, but it does mean that everybody's on the radar, because there's a duty to assist all households and to take reasonable steps with all households. And again, the way in which we see that playing out is when we draw some international comparisons. We did have an element of international comparison through the literature. There isn't much written, but we see that plays out as significant later on. And then also that rough sleeping was already on the agenda in all three nations in slightly different ways, but it was on the agenda prior to the COVID outbreak. And also, with the Homeless Action Group and the homeless strategy that the Welsh Government had produced prior to the outbreak, and in Scotland, we already had rapid rehousing on the agenda and an agenda of moving away from unsuitable temporary accommodation. Those hadn't been achieved and haven't been achieved yet, but they were on the agenda. They were already part of the policy direction. Thanks, Gwyn. So in terms of the headline responses, in the report, we break down some of these into into 5 categories, and go and have a look at the report. We can share the link, I think, to delegates. But if you have a look, we've just tried to do the useful thing and compile a timeline of what happened in the different nations as best we can. Please have a read and feel free to come back at me and say, Pete, you have totally missed this. How have you not put that in? And we'll add it into the final report where, it's just really important. And even when we were doing the interviews, how quickly we forget how challenging the times were, and it becomes normal practice. And a big role for this research is just documenting that. And so we've documented some of those things, and the themes that come out. Funding is a key theme across all 3 nations, but my goodness, it varied. We know very well, and I'm sure John's talked about the speed at which Wales moved on funding and the scale at which Wales moved on funding. Scotland, far less so, and did it through enhanced discretionary housing payments. Wales, we had the 2 main phases of funding, including substantial capital funding and a willingness to increase that. In England was perhaps the trickiest place to document and to follow the money. I think even the Audit Office has found that when they were trying to document the amount of new money, because there was a lot of bringing forward spend. There were new announcements, if you look in the report, almost monthly, and discerning which is new and which was already announced previously was quite tricky to follow. We've done our best in the report, but either way, there was money made available, both revenue and capital. We'll come on to talk about some of the limitations of that in a bit. And then in terms of homelessness policy and law, clear ministerial statements in Wales and England, but particularly in Wales. That's where it was clearest, and we're unambiguous about that in the report. And that related to, the commitment to accommodating all people who are rough sleeping, whether there's priority need, no recourse to public funds, but everybody, and really, really clear in Wales. In the rental sector, we had the evictions moratorium and then extension to notice periods. And again, that was already in the pipeline in Wales. And then a number of welfare policy changes, which had quite varied impacts across the GB nations. But things like pauses in work-related conditionality, sanctions and deductions, we don't in the homeless sector tend to talk about those so much, but they proved to be quite important. Realignment of local housing allowance rates, and then the weekly uplift in universal credit payments. So lots of policy activity that we've documented. The other theme that I've not put on the slide is around immigration policy. So there was a pause on evictions from national asylum accommodation, though that restarted, and local authorities were allowed to accommodate homeless EEA nationals. But then there was this kind of contradiction in immigration policy, where kind of end of December 2020, right at the end of our study period, rough sleeping becomes grounds for losing the right to remain. So quite a contradiction. So again, we've just documented all those key changes. Next slide, please, Gwyn. God, you're very efficient, Gwyn. I like this. You can come and help me out with lectures. So to say, the bulk of the presentation now is just drawing out some of those key themes and reflecting. There's about 9 themes that I'll talk to. Next slide, please, Gwyn. So the overall message from pretty much every key informant we spoke to is that this was an effective crisis response. It was timely, it was effective, and importantly underpinned by a kind of a shift in mindset. A shift in mindset that saw homelessness as a public health issue, a public health crisis, a public health emergency that then warranted the sort of urgency that we in the sector have been asking for a very, very long time. But the message is a positive one, and you've got a couple of quotes there that I think encapsulate the sort of feeling in the sector, both in Wales and in England. So I think Wales's response to this pandemic in terms of homelessness has been fantastic. Leadership at the top, funding, and the hard work and graft and the intelligence of people on the ground. And very similarly in England, the speed around the resourcing, the relaxation of benefits, and the kind of help to local authorities, the focus on no recourse to public funds and easing on that that's been really good. Just let's get the job done, whatever it takes. And that kind of whatever it takes message was really clear. And I think certainly the local authorities that we spoke with, there was a real welcoming of giving us the tools and allowing us to get on. Now, not all local authorities were able to do it for various reasons, but the ability to then go and deliver on this kind of expectation was clear. And that in a very, very coarse measure, and again, this came out in interviews, in a very coarse measure, stopped the scale of death and infection that we were all really, really worried about. Because if we'd carried on as normal, we would have seen that. All the modelling work that's been done by colleagues in London showed us that that's where we would have been. So, as a headline, there was success. And we look internationally, and there are states in the US where we're up to 2/3 of the shelter residents in some cities were infected during the pandemic. Now, we don't have great data on the early phases because we weren't testing so well, but we don't think we saw that level of infection. Next slide, please, Gwyn. So we wanted also just to pause and reflect a little bit on on who was being assisted, who local authorities were working with, and again just document that. So unsurprisingly, the message and the data in England, we don't have it in Scotland and Wales for understandable reasons just yet, was that we had an increase in rough sleepers and single adults coming through the door and being assisted, including hidden homeless households. And that was particularly in England. You know, all the narratives in England about the sheer number of people that weren't on the radar. That was a message that came through clear. So that was the area in which we saw an increase in folk being assisted, but then we saw reductions, particularly in evictions. So if you look at the kind of green and violet lines that plummet in that graph that you're seeing now, they're evictions from social and private rented tenancies that just plummet. And doesn't that just lay bare the role of evictions in homelessness, that structural driver of homelessness? That should be the sort of thing that's feeding into our thinking about, well, if we want to end homelessness, look at what we could achieve if we could just address that driver, that trigger, of homelessness. Next slide, please, Gwyn. God, I really do know how Chris Whitty feels now. It's wonderful, the power and the control of seeing it. Don't fiddle with the slides now, Gwyn, just because Anyway, so third theme, strong leadership, undoubtedly as a theme. So ministers, civil servants with really unprecedented leadership in terms of homelessness. And that's particularly in England and Wales. As we comment on that third bullet, there just wasn't the same necessity in Scotland for that level of leadership because of the existing provisions already there. But again, we'll give a bit more detail on that shortly. But that leadership was characterized by speed, clarity of direction, funding, a desire for partnership, working. And actually, when we start to compare to the limited evidence that we have internationally, what we seem to be finding is where you've got that really strong central government leadership, is where we seem to have the most positive impacts and the positive changes in the homelessness response. Where that lacked, you had huge variation, lots of inappropriate temporary accommodation still being used, where that central leadership was lacking. And that's actually in the vast majority of countries. Next point to make, so that was the start of the pandemic response. We saw quite a big divergence as early as kind of May time. We start to see kind of mixed messages emerging from MHCLG in England. And in particular, there was a letter on the 28th of May that basically reminded local authorities that they could only lawfully accommodate people who were ineligible for benefits following some sort of individual assessment of risk to life. And once you receive a letter like that, the consequence is inevitable. And that was that you end up with much more varied local practice, far more people being excluded from that temporary accommodation or that provision of move on. So whereas the message in Wales stayed really clear, in Scotland, there was never the same need for the message because of the existing provisions. And we can't then forget, there was an awful lot said about central government leadership, but there were also messages about the local authorities and third sector leadership roles. And we've seen that. And I saw that through the research, but I also saw that through my own practice, ethnographically, if you want to call it that, seeing what was coming through the sector into my inbox, etc., and then engaging with some of the conversations around that. We had a really, really strong third sector that was able to galvanise and drive in a way that, again, in England we didn't see. And in Scotland was less necessary, though again the third sector did play, the changes that did happen in Scotland, the third sector played a key role in. Gwyn, next slide, please. Right, so related to the leadership issue, and actually in the report we deal with it in the same chapter, is this idea of partnership working. And I don't think we can deny that there were changes in the way in which previously siloed services were working, and I'm sure, so I didn't make yesterday, sorry, but I'm sure that came up with Tracy and others in terms of conversations. And this quote from Scotland could equally apply in most other places. So it says, I think during the crisis, there's been a relaxation of professional boundaries, much more horizontal connections and collaborative working. So that's been really positive, and we can't lose that. If we do go back to a more professional boundaries and siloed working, that'll be a barrier to progress. So there's a determination to not let that happen. And that was true in Wales too, that we've got to embrace that partnership working that we saw emerge, at least in the early stages of the crisis. There's a couple of other interesting points to make. One is about the particular engagement with volunteer and faith groups, who've often operated in kind of parallel systems, sometimes in conflict with local authorities and other third sector partners. But actually in the pandemic, most of those were either closed down or brought into partnership in exactly the way that we've been asking for and hoping for, and often coordinated in a way where, for instance, they were delivering food to folk in their accommodation, rather than serving and enabling folk to remain on the streets. Some really, really good partnership working there to learn from. Of course, there was some silo working, some difficulties, particularly in the commissioning of some of the temporary accommodation. There were quite a few examples of health and homelessness battling over commissioning the same, for instance, temporary hotel provision or whatever. Okay, so that's partnership working. Next slide, please. So funding, we talked about kind of, the nature of the funding, the unprecedented nature of the funding, how welcomed it was, and enabled a lot of the achievements that we outline in the report and I'll talk about just now. But there were some issues and concerns, particularly around, and my goodness, I think, have I ever written a report where I've not talked about short-term funding? This issue of having funding on a short-term basis with no sustainability means that, what can you do in terms of staff resourcing? Well, you're really limited, aren't you, of being able to bolster that team. And that's what we were hearing in the commentary from local authorities was, it was great to have the revenue funding, but it was really tricky to spend sustainably in the way that local authorities would have wanted to. In England in particular, there was then a kind of message about the fast turnaround in bidding for this funding, because, as I said, there were monthly announcements. In Wales, we had kind of 2 clear announcements in this particular period that we were looking at. But in England, if you look at our timeline, they're monthly announcements, and each of those requiring some sort of bidding process, which, at a time when you're dealing with crisis, is really, really tricky to respond to and to make the most of, and to think through, actually, how can we most effectively use that funding? And also a critique that it was largely focused overwhelmingly on rough sleeping and not enabling some of the other spending that local authorities might have wanted. Again, that was particularly in England. Thanks, Gwyn. Next slide. Unsurprisingly, access to accommodation comes up as a major theme. So again, I use the term, and we use the term in the report, unprecedented, because it really is. So much of what happened was unprecedented. But the way in which accommodation was accessed, was truly as if we treated homelessness as a crisis in the way that we've always argued for. So all of a sudden, we're provisioning and accessing accommodation that we would never have considered before in order to get folk off the streets and give them somewhere to self-isolate. So hotels, B&Bs, holiday lets, university accommodation, RSL properties, their voids, etc., all brought on board. And what was really, really interesting to see was a recognition, a clear direction from government, from central government, to say, these are the criteria by which we want you to pursue and access accommodation, but you work within your local markets and what's available. So that might mean more B&Bs in coastal areas, more hotels in cities, and in university accommodation in university towns, but just go and access what you can. So again, that really was unprecedented, and lots of really quick action in order to access that accommodation. So dealing with insurance liabilities. There are examples of Cardiff, for instance, commissioning accommodation at risk of not yet knowing that funding was available. There was a lot of really positive practice to make sure folk had access to temporary accommodation. So there was this bringing in of new, but there was also some decommissioning and decanting. particularly in England, where there were the kind of more dormitory style accommodation, temporary accommodation being used, or night shelters, etc. And over half of English local authorities said they had some of that provision prior to the pandemic and were having to decommission, decant, restructure that accommodation. So the message was largely positive, was very positive there, and it reflects some of the international practice in terms of let's just access accommodation. But one of the challenges we did have is that sort of accommodation and the support that can be brought alongside didn't meet the needs of some of the folk we're trying to support, who have higher support needs, that needed very particular types of supported accommodation that we found ourselves wanting for. We really discovered we didn't have enough of this provision, and that should be a message going forward. It really did lay bare the nature of the provision that we're lacking. So that was one of the challenges. And of course, that has consequences. It had consequences for people's safety, both the individuals, staff, and others around them and their communities. Access to move on accommodation, of course, that was beginning to be the big challenge later in the kind of this research period, and the kind of the stymieing of the system because of, we weren't making new lets, evictions had stopped, etc. So the system was stymied. But also there were really practical issues in terms of moving people on. Even if you could find the accommodation, and RSLs were trying really hard, we struggled with access to white goods, with removal service, the furloughing of maintenance staff, sourcing building materials to bring properties up to standard. All those things are important to document because we will very quickly forget that was ever a problem. So those were challenges that stopped move on for some. And then, of course, there's been the recommencement of lettings and RSLs. What was most impressive was that quite a number of RSLs are simply saying, really prioritising homeless households for the lets that were available, overwhelmingly prioritising homeless households. And we were also helped in some instances by LHA rates changing, particularly in Edinburgh and in London. So access to accommodation. Moving on, please, Gwyn. Right. So this the seventh of our themes is workforce and working practices. And again, not so long ago, when we're researching homelessness in Wales, but UK and elsewhere, you wouldn't often get comments about workforce, working practices, but about the workforce. In pretty much everything I've done in about the past kind of 4 or 5 years, the workforce has been kind of central to everything that's being discussed. It tells us, yeah, things are happening, but it also tells us that we really, really need to address the workforce challenges, to basically improve support and conditions for our workforce, because they're fundamental to the success of what we're trying to do. And I just love this quote. So I'm going to read it out. In terms of our staff, I think it's the one time I've been rendered speechless about how to actually articulate what people have done and how willing they've been to do so. We've had a huge commitment from staff. All of the investment in values-based culture over many years was never more evident. Now, that came from a Scotland key informant, but I know at least 4 leaders in our third sector organisations in Wales that I could have attributed that quote to. And not least being rendered speechless would be marvellous for some of them. But that ethos-driven recruitment, that the role that staff played, the commitment and the willingness to go the extra mile, is so clear. And we've got to support that workforce to be able to keep doing that. So that's my favourite quote of the entire report in terms of representing what happened. But there were challenges. So shifting to working online, not least the dealing with the technology, but there were challenges of it. So some people that we spoke to who'd experienced homelessness in COVID had difficulties accessing services when everything was basically moving online. Interestingly, they weren't really talking about homelessness services. They were talking about the allied support services rather than the actual homelessness, the housing options team, or the homelessness charity. But there were difficulties as a result of moving online. But in terms of the workforce, the point to raise is folk were often having to support folk online from the kitchen table, from the living room, wherever it was that you were doing your support from. And all those traumas that you're amassing in terms of the support, the vicarious trauma of giving this support, is happening in your home. And that came out quite clearly in terms of research of, well, actually, we couldn't get in place often all the support mechanisms we needed to. Some organisations were working really hard and changed practice to do that, where they were able to, but there were lots of examples where actually organisations weren't able to really make sure, but also some of the informal interactions that proved to be so important in our kind of managing and responding to those traumas, you don't have because you're not nipping into the office, you're not around colleagues in the same way. So a real challenge for frontline staff. And there are also concerns over initial access to PPE. So now I think quite a few of those, a few organisations could be major providers of PPE because they've got so much stored now. But at the early stages, it was a real challenge for some organisation. There are also issues of staff not being prioritised for access to hubs for schooling of their children because they weren't seen as a priority sector. So some real challenges, and actually says a lot about the way others perceive our homelessness frontline workforce, and we've got a job to do there. And I know we're beginning to win that battle, but there's a job. The pandemic laid that bare in front of us. Okay, next slide, please, Gwyn. So as I've alluded to for quite a while, is that there's the role of pre-crisis policy was really, really important. And I'll just touch on those key policies now. So in England, the Homeless Reduction Act and Rough Sleeping Initiative kind of laid the foundations for the response in England. And what we were hearing from local authorities is, look, had we not had the Homeless Reduction Act, we were surprised by how many hidden homeless people appeared at the door, but so many more people were in one of the quotes, in plain sight, than they would have been before. So they were known to, or services were experienced in terms of responding to them. But also through the Rough Sleepers Initiative, that you had rough sleeper teams, there was a service out there able to go and support people to come in. So that was the kind of the main pre-crisis policy influence in England. In Scotland, of course, the abolition of priority need is really hard, to evaluate, having just done this in terms of the priority need report, to evaluate the impacts of priority need in Scotland. But in some ways, COVID has been the best evaluation of that policy that we've had, because you just have to compare the response in England and Wales from Scotland. In Scotland, it really wasn't the same fundamental change in approach as it was in England and Wales. They weren't rushing around in the same way. In Scotland, the minister barely had to make the announcement. So priority needs abolition showed us, for all of the critiques that we've laid upon the Scottish system of having lots of people in temporary accommodation, actually it proved that a lot of that is fairly suitable temporary accommodation, many of which are now being flipped into permanent tenancies. And of course, in Scotland, there was the commitment to rapid rehousing and with the transition plan. So again, attempting to move people on quicker from that temporary accommodation is, they were able to kind of in their equivalent phase 2, but just really drive that agenda forward. And in Wales, of course, we had the Welsh Government Homelessness Strategy and the Homeless Action Group recommendations and the things that were emerging from that. And we saw that most crucially feeding into the phase 2 plan. So we almost had a kind of a roadmap ready to go. And of course, the priority need review had happened. And we now, as we heard from the Minister, there's a commitment not to go back in terms of priority need. But in that report, we've got an idea of what some of those barriers are that we actually do now need to be grappling with if we really want to implement that change. And that really does require engagement with local authorities because they are the ones having to implement that. Okay, Gwyn, moving on. We're very nearly there. So this is, just before I get to the last point on horizon, I did say I'd be done in tons of time, but I'm totally not, Katie, right? So I'm really nearly there. So here's a quote from one of our Welsh key informants. So there were certain things that we were not comfortable being part of our future homelessness response. I think what the pandemic did was move us to where we wanted to get to much more quickly. So it was all of a sudden, because of public health reasons, that was unacceptable. But I think in lots of people's minds, that's never where we wanted what we wanted homeless services to look like. And really what that quote is saying is the pandemic enabled us to move at a speed that we'd never imagined, but it's kind of in the direction that we'd always wanted to be traveling anyway. But it is also, and we saw this in England too, and to a lesser extent in Scotland, it's a shame that it took the pandemic for us to treat this like a crisis. And we cannot forget that notion of crisis. And that's the way that we should be responding to homelessness, full stop. Next slide, please, Gwyn, and then we really are nearly there. So on the horizon, what's next in terms of the research and the agenda? So we asked participants about their concerns about what was on the horizon. And in the next phase of the research, we'll be trying to look at the extent to which some of those concerns are materializing, but also whether some of the hopes and the aspirations are being achieved in this next phase, post-December 2020. So we'll be looking at some of the actions taken to address the sector concerns. So, was Move On effective? Some of the Move On offers, were they effective? How many people were returning to homelessness? There's a whole agenda around no evictions into homelessness. What's happening there? People were talking concerned and using language of tidal waves, etc. To what extent have we been able to prevent that? There were issues around around some of the potential kind of path dependencies that are being created or have been created in the kind of phase 1 and phase 2 response here in Wales. So, we've had major investment in some congregate forms of temporary accommodation that run counter to where we want to be and our goal. And look, if you build that sort of accommodation, I always draw the analogy of kind of a motorway. When you open another lane, you'll fill it, and you'll always continue to fill those lanes. If we continue to build these forms of congruent accommodation, we will fill them, and it then becomes really hard to decommission those. So we need to be investing in the sorts of accommodation that folk want to live in, in settled, permanent ways. So we'll be looking into that a little bit about some of the path dependencies that we've maybe created. And then finally, all the hopes that folk have talked about a better policy, practice, environment that can come from this. And look, in the report, I have to apologize, we talk about building back better, coming from my work on development and crisis and conflict in the global south. But I absolutely love and now embrace the shift to talk about building back fairer that's coming from the sector. So we'll be amending the wording in our final report to talk about building back fairer and how these changes are enabling that. That's it. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much. Thanks, Glyn, for all your help. Seamlessly done.
Thanks very much, Pete. That was really comprehensive, and I'm sure a lot of the themes that you touched on will really resonate with a lot of people here today. But really interesting to hear about the different approaches in the different nations and how important that policy and legislative context was in terms of being the foundation and springboard for the response. We have a few questions. A reminder that you can submit questions through the Q&A tab in Hoover, so please do so. So first up, Pete, what do you think is the most important learning from each of the three nations? If you had to pick one thing from each of the three nations, what do you think that would be?
Oh, crikey, it's just got to be different from each nation. Oh, right.
It can be the same, no pressure.
Okay. For sure, leadership was the main one I think we take from Wales. That was it was unprecedented, and it led to the sort of change that we've needed. So leadership, and that central government leadership, absolutely. When we drew the international comparison, where you didn't have that, and it was just happening at state or community level, you just had a whole mix of things. but government saying you will do this, and this is, these are the principles you've got to follow, and then some accountability through partnership, which was done through at more local level. That was brilliant. That's the learning that key learning from Wales. Learning of the kind of not what to do in England is what I would take is, the mixed messaging. The moment you send a caveated letter that says however or but or muddies the water, we had a little bit of that. We undermined things, but also I think on funding, in England, if you compare the initial outlays of funding in England and Wales, that they were just incomparable. England made up for that. There was a lot more funding came after, but it was piecemeal. And so you just can't, local authorities, when you're dealing in a crisis, cannot be responding on a monthly basis to bid for funding. So making that available and enabling local authorities to then just get on was probably the message in England. And in Scotland, undoubtedly the abolition of priority need is the message. As I say, it was like a natural experiment, a natural evaluation, because it wasn't there, and you can just compare the nature of the response. It wasn't the same crisis.
Thanks very much, Pete. Yeah, and that's obviously really pertinent to the situation in Wales. That we heard the Minister yesterday reiterate her commitment to not going back to the situation with rationing and priority need, but we know that there's huge challenges to implement that going forward, and I know that you've detailed that in your research, and we've shared a link to the research you've talked about today in the chat and in the community section, and we'll also put your priority need research. You'll be pleased to know, everyone, that there's also a summary document that accompanies the 200-page research document on priority need. We've had a question from the audience: how can we ensure that the efforts of faith-based groups and voluntary groups continue to be connected to services and not siloed? So I think you briefly mentioned how not the kind of established third sector, but the kind of community voluntary sector and faith sector, who've actually assisted with that more strategic approach to ending homelessness, and how we can maybe build on that going forward, because that does require a bit of a change in approach and mindset, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And I'm probably not the one, I'm an academic, I'm not on the ground. This is one for you. It's really interesting because we documented how that changed in the crisis, but as soon as lockdown opened up, things did start to, and we'll pick this up in the next report, have started to disentangle. You're getting the silos and the counterproductive work starting to happen again, and it's the question is, how do you kind of re-engage with those those organizations, often faith-based organizations, and really well-meaning organizations with people giving up huge amounts of time. So all I can do is reiterate the challenge, but we made it happen during COVID. Partly it's because of where people are, in those organizations, you're serving people where they are, and so they were able to, the only place that they could help was in people's accommodation. Now some folk are returning to the streets, and you can open up whatever facility you want, then there is a tendency to shift back, and for me it's then local leadership. You need really strong local leadership saying, come under the umbrella, here's what we achieved. And I got approached by a local authority to say, we're reverting back, what do we do? And actually it didn't go anywhere. We were meant to be convening a meeting and it didn't go anywhere. Leadership stopped. It just stopped in the inbox of that local leader. So I think that's local leadership. It has to be, but we really can't go back.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, we need to not put the pressure on those faith-based and voluntary groups as if, they're part of a problem, because actually they've done incredible work supporting people in the most compassionate way over the decades. And you know what? It's not just that part of the sector that has to change. It's every part of the sector. We all have to reflect. Local authorities have to reflect on how people have been deemed qualifying for housing or not qualifying for housing. Support services need to think about how they're set up and what services might need to look like and transform in the future. And we need to be really inclusive. And I think where people have that compassion and want to support people, then bring them into the tent, make sure that all partners, regardless regardless of what part of the sector they come from, understand what the ambition and vision is for the future of homelessness services, and use those strengths and as you say, the amazing compassion, the hours that people put in, and try and make sure that we're all kind of working together alongside each other, and try and avoid some of that professional snobbery that I think the homelessness sector experiences from other sectors, and the same time, with our brilliant volunteers out in our communities. How important do you think was the sort of decision in the summer to talk about transformation as phase 2? I think we were still very much in the crisis period, and it would have been easy, I think, to just continue having that crisis response. But officials, ministers, stakeholders, got together and said, okay, this is an opportunity to think about what we want the future to look like. And so how important do you think that decision was, despite being still in the firefighting stage, to be able to step back and think about what the future looks, and the HAG report being a foundation for that?
Fundamental. For those that don't know, my other research area is around the informal economy of the global south. We've just finished a kind of 5-country study around post-conflict cities. So this idea of dealing in crisis and post-conflict, the major problem you have in those contexts is that you divide the humanitarian sector from the development sector. They are separate parts of every organization. They are separate NGOs, et cetera, et cetera. And so you have the humanitarian response that attempts to save lives. And it's about food provision, shelter provision, refugee camps, whatever. And then development sector that waits to come along until the time is right that we start moving on development trajectory. And everything we know is that is a huge problem, because the humanitarian sector comes in, saves life, but then builds a refugee camp on the only land that was available for perhaps industrial use, or around agricultural land, or whatever, that was going to be really productive and was going to be your route to economic development. And there was never any conversation that actually that wasn't the right thing to do. And a whole heap of other quite detrimental things that sometimes happen in terms of the humanitarian response affecting development response. So if you can bring in both of those actors, and that's essentially what's happened, is you've started looking towards the future before you've dealt with the immediate crisis, then it means that some of the things, so when I talked about the path dependencies, it stops you, really investing in some potentially problematic forms of accommodation and services or whatever, because you know that that's going to be really difficult to disentangle and really counterproductive to achieving your end goal. So I think it was really, really important. Now, of course, the messaging and how it's received is another thing, because if I'm in a local authority or a charity that is literally just at the end of my energy and compassion and everything, then it's hard to receive something that says, by the way, here's the plan for the next 2 years. I get that. And I'm not sure there's a simple solution to how you get that right, other than work together.
Thanks very much, Pete. And finally, quick question before we finish up. What do you think the biggest challenge is for Wales moving forward as we start to come out of the worst of the pandemic, and look towards having that kind of fairer future?
Oh, goodness. So our biggest challenge, I think it's supply of social housing where people want to live is a big challenge. And then long-term investment in our workforce, the folk that are actually going to assist people, when we get to crisis. So that's our big challenge. I can't give a talk and not talk about moving upstream. All of this is crisis focused. There's loads we can be doing to stop folk becoming homeless in the first place. We do need to move upstream. Sorry, that didn't quite answer the question.
I think you gave us two key answers there. Thanks, Pete. And those are themes that we've heard over the past day and a bit. So absolutely.
Kate, let me just pinch the opportunity as well, and to say to do it in collaboration. Local authorities have to be around the table driving this too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've seen what we can achieve when people come together during this pandemic, and I think it'll be really important to continue working in that collaborative approach going forward, understanding the challenges that each organisation faces, and working together to overcome those. Pete, thanks so much for your time today. That was a fantastic presentation, really brilliant to hear your reflections. I think we've all been in the mix, here in Wales, but it's really useful to hear some of the learning across England and Scotland as well as as the common themes across Great Britain. I think there's plenty that we can take and learn and move forward with from there. So thank you very much indeed, Pete. That's the end of this session. We'll be moving to our next session at about 11 o'clock, which is focused on leadership reflections during a crisis, a theme that was front and centre of Pete's presentation. I'm really delighted we'll be hearing from Claire Budden, Chief Executive of Clwyd Allen, and Lindsay Cordery-Bruce, Chief Exec of the Woolwich, on their leadership reflections during a crisis. Grab a cup of tea and we'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you.